like many industries, COVID-19 has been terrible for the oil and gas industry. But in fact, 2020 was off to a bad start even before COVID-19 hit. To understand that, we have to take a look at some trends over the past 5 years in the industry. We talked about how Saudi was the swing producer. In other words, they were the person that dialed up or down their production to try to maintain the stability of oil prices. And we talked about how in the 2014 era, Saudi said not going to do it, and they were trying to drive out the shale companies. Remember, we talked about in class, shale is the high cost oil to produce. And so they thought if they allowed the price to drop, all of the shale companies would go out of business. Well, that didn't happen. And then finally, in 2016, you see this description of OPEC plus. That's OPEC plus Russia. And so that brings in obviously the second or third or first, depending on what year you look at it, top oil producer. So by bringing Russia into the equation, you get a very powerful negotiating block. And you can see that they cut their production. There's an article on the web that in D2L that I want you to read that talks about why they agree to cut production and what people's interests are. And one of the questions is this going to last and how durable is this? So they cut production, oil prices went up, and then back in 2018, they said, we can afford to increase production a little bit. Oil prices stayed relatively stable because the demand for oil was also increasing. And then they start trying to reach agreements to cut, because even though the demand for world oil is slowly increasing, what's happening in the U.S., the shale producers are just really increasing production. But as we got into 2020, Saudi Arabia became concerned about these reductions, and they felt like they were being mistreated. You see that on this chart. The green line is the U.S. shale producers, and you can see that by percentage of the world oil market, the U.S.'s share is growing. Who controls U.S. shale or U.S. oil production in general? And the answer is the market does. That's the U.S. market responds primarily, I would almost say solely, to price signals. And so that leaves it to Russia and OPEC to try to dial things up and down to make it work. Well, over time, Saudi Arabia became upset over their declining market share. And as they started off into 2020, they declared a price war. And it's in the March timeframe, Saudi says, not only are we not going to cut, we're actually going to increase our production of oil because we want to protect our market share. And you can see what that did to prices very, very quickly. And then what's happening at the same time? COVID-19 has spread beyond China and is beginning to affect the rest of the world. But the oil industry was already off to a bad start in 2020 based on this Saudi-Russia price war. And then it just got worse. This is an unprecedented reduction in consumption of oil. There's no historical analog to this. And you can see that even though production came down, it still didn't come down as low as consumption dropped. Although, again, you get into the forecast, which is to say this is a guess. What's really happening to demand, nobody knows. But this is what they're faced with. And if you look at this number, 90 million barrels a day, even if it climbs back to that, that's still almost a 10% reduction over what it was. If it gets to 95 million, it's still a 5% reduction. And what we've seen in class is when you have even a 1 to 2 million barrel a day mismatch between supply and demand, typically the price goes crazy. So this is a big deal. Not surprisingly, this had a tremendous impact on prices. You see that historically, this is a 12-month snapshot. Oil had been running comfortably in the mid-50s for much of 2019. Then we get into 2020, and this is when Saudi Arabia declares war on the world with its price, or with its increase, and you see the price drop dramatically. With the agreements, it recovered slightly, and then the full impact of COVID-19 came, and boom, it dropped again. And now you can see typically oil is running in around $40, maybe 43 for WTI. You can see on this particular day that I snapshotted the slide, it was $42. So you have the industry faced with a collapse in demand, which translates to a dramatic reduction in price. And whether oil can stay in the 40s is an open question. So you go, gee, why are all these companies so willing to sell their oil when it's so cheap? Why don't they just say, well, we're going to quit for a year, we're going to hold our oil where it is, let demand go back up, and then we'll start to pump again and we'll get a lot more money for our oil? There are a couple of reasons, or several reasons. The first is when you shut in a well, is what it's called. When you turn it off, you're never quite sure what's going to happen when you turn the well back on. And so companies are reluctant to do that. But they did. They did do that. But it's risky because you don't know what's going to happen afterwards. As an aside, our teeny weeny well that makes, or series of wells that make 25 barrels a day on average, what our operator did is he went and he rented a big tank, and they just put the oil in the tank for about a month or about 2 weeks to keep us from having to sell when oil was around $15 a barrel. And they just told us this month that they were going to sell that oil. So pretty good gain for us, selling it at $40 a barrel oil versus $15 a barrel. The next reason is you have lease obligations, and we'll talk about this more later, but if you stop production, then you're potentially opening yourself up to the lessor saying you violated the lease, get off my land. And then finally, even though $10 a barrel of oil is terrible price, if you need the cash, you need the cash. So for all of these reasons, it's not as easy to turn off the supply of oil as you think it might be, particularly in the United States. But you do see an unprecedented drop in production in May. So it went from 13 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day. So this was a tremendous reduction in the U.S. market. Let's look at what the financial implications are for the companies in the next video.